Box 13.4, Over-imitation. Though often selective in terms of whom to imitate, children appear to be less discriminating about what to imitate. As described in section 13.5, children are more likely than chimpanzees to imitate the extraneous actions of a demonstrator. This behavior, often called over-imitation, has been shown across cultures, and it increases with age over childhood. Over-imitation exists for such actions as waving a stick over an apparatus or lightly tapping a cover, even when children are left alone and motivated to work as fast as possible. Several theories have been posited as to why over-imitation occurs, although so far none has satisfactorily explained all the factors. Carpenter, Metzoff, and Nielsen suggest that children over-imitate the actions of adult demonstrators in order to promote affiliation with the demonstrator. Lyons et al. 2007 suggests that even in a causally transparent system, children may come to believe that the non-causal actions are somehow necessary to achieve the final goal. Others, in contrast, have shown that children are able to differentiate between necessary and irrelevant actions, suggesting that they do not believe the non-causal actions truly serve a mechanistic purpose. Instead, these researchers suggest that over-imitation occurs because children interpret the demonstrated actions as social conventions or norms that should be copied. Indeed, human behavior is strongly influenced by cultural practices that have conventions, specifying what one typically does, and norms, specifying what one ought to do. This allows us to act collectively, for example, to create artifacts that we all use in certain ways, and to have a common framework for what constitutes appropriate action. Preschool-aged children are already aware of this, heartily protesting, "No, it does not go like this," when others act in direct contrast with the rules of a game. It is thus possible that some instances of social learning in humans may be constrained so as to place importance on the manner in which a goal was achieved, even if this sometimes leads to inefficient behavior. The potential benefit of this cognitive system, however, is the learning of actions that are conventional and normative in one society. The conflicting interpretations of the results from artificial fruit tasks likely stem from the fact that it can be difficult for a researcher to decide whether the actions that an observer produces match those of the demonstrator to a sufficient extent. As mentioned earlier, some researchers have suggested that a more productive research question may be how the observer decides what aspects of an action to reproduce, not whether the reproduction is actually imitation. In the next section, this question will be considered, again in studies comparing the behavior of chimpanzees and children. Switching between imitation and emulation. In some instances, copying the exact actions of a model can result in inefficient behavior, for example when the model is demonstrating actions that are extraneous or not causally relevant. Thus, one could argue that as long as a species has an understanding of the object physics involved, causally irrelevant actions may be disregarded, which in turn would lead to end-state emulation instead of imitation. In a seminal study on this topic, Horner and Whiten 2005 tested young chimpanzees and 4-year-old children with two different boxes containing reward, food for the chimpanzees, stickers for the children. One box was made of clear plastic and the other was opaque, but in all other ways they were identical. Figure 13.8. The human demonstrator used a stick to reveal a hole at the top of the box and then pushed the stick into this hole, tapping on a plastic ledge 3 times. The stick was then removed and inserted into a second hole, retrieving the reward. When the box is clear, it is apparent that the actions in the first hole are causally unrelated to obtaining the reward. The ledge that the stick taps is separate from the area housing the reward. With the opaque box, however, the causal relevance of this action is not immediately apparent. Figure 13.8. Apparatus used in Horner and Whiten 2005. A human demonstrator was observed to engage in an irrelevant action, e.g. touching the tool to the interior ledge, prior to inserting the tool into the front of the apparatus and retrieving a reward. When the box was clear, the irrelevant and relevant actions are apparent, but with the opaque box, The causal relevance of the action at the top of the box, touching the ledge, is not immediately apparent. When the opaque box was presented first, both children and chimpanzees replicated all of the demonstrator's actions, showing evidence of imitation. However, with the clear box, only the children repeated the extraneous action, even though an understanding of barriers and solidity is assumed to be present by this age. When the clear box was presented first, chimpanzees skipped the irrelevant action and continued to skip it with the opaque box. Children, in contrast, always repeated all the actions. Horner and White in 2005 suggest that chimpanzees thus attend to different aspects of the demonstration depending on the situation. When the causal structure of a task is clear, emulation may occur more readily than imitation. In contrast, children may be more strongly biased to imitate over imitation. Attending to a model's intention. Even though human children often imitate even the extraneous actions of others, they are not complete slaves to imitation. Toddlers, for example, imitate intentional actions but do not repeat superficially similar accidental acts. Further, young children appear to imitate actions based on the rationality of the action given the goal and the current situational constraints. When young children watched a demonstrator turn on a light by using her forehead while her hands were occupied holding a blanket, they subsequently turned on the light with their hands. Compared to this condition, after witnessing a demonstrator whose hands were not holding anything, yet used her head, children were more likely to use their own heads to turn on the light. These findings suggest that children interpreted the use of the head action, even when hands were available, as indicating that the purpose of the action was to turn on the light with the head, instead of just to turn on the light. Thus, when learning from others, children may take into account the likely goal of a demonstrator given the current constraints and either engage in a direct copy of the actions, e.g. use their head, or choose an alternative means, e.g. use their hands, a form of goal emulation. Similar results to Gergely et al. 2002 have been found for chimpanzees using an analogous task. Chimpanzees observed a human demonstrator operating 6 objects using an unusual body part, e.g. pressing with the forehead. Again, in 2 conditions, the demonstrator would either have free or occupied hands. Like the young children, chimpanzees repeated the modeled action using the unusual body part more often when the demonstrator's hands were free. However, 2 aspects of these findings suggest that further research is necessary. First, using the unusual body part is actually quite infrequent, though it does occur more in the free hand conditions as predicted. Second, it is still unclear as to the manner in which chimpanzees interpret the goals of others, e.g. by representing behavior or representing the mental states that underlie behavior. In sum, though, it is possible that at least for children and chimpanzees, decisions regarding what aspects of observed actions should be copied may be influenced by consideration of the underlying goal. Culture. When considering human society, culture refers to population-specific shared traditions, beliefs, and behaviors. Human culture is shared from one human generation to another by a combination of social learning processes, language, and teaching. See box 13.5. Thus, the field of comparative cognition has been hesitant to use the term culture, though examination of the foundations of human culture in non-human primates is an active research endeavor incorporating strict operational definitions. Much of this work has been conducted with chimpanzees, both in the wild and in captivity. Box 13.5. Do animals teach? In social learning research, the term demonstrator is commonly used to denote an individual whose behavior is being observed, regardless of whether this individual recognizes that he or she is being observed or alters behavior to better impart information. But can any animal species be said to demonstrate in the sense of teaching? In 1992, Caro and Hauser created a functional definition of teaching that has been widely accepted today. To be considered teaching, an individual must modify behavior in front of naive individuals in a manner that increases the chance of learning, incur immediate cost to oneself, and cause the student to learn something more rapidly than would have occurred otherwise. Currently, the most systematic study suggesting teaching in an animal species focused on meerkats. Meerkats are mammals found in southern Africa that engage in cooperative breeding. Pups are reared by many members of the group, and when adults leave to search for food, the young follow and make begging calls. These calls encourage the adults to bring them prey, including scorpions, which can be difficult to kill. The manner in which the prey is presented varies with the age, and thus experience of the pup. Young pups are given dead or disabled prey, while older pups are given intact prey. Additionally, the time spent with a pup after providing prey is dependent on the pup's age, with younger pups being accompanied longer. A follow-up experiment found that provisioning of disabled prey does facilitate learning relative to an unprovisioned control group. Thus, all three of Caro and Hauser's requirements for teaching are met. The adults vary the type of prey provided based on the age of the pup. A cost is likely incurred due to loss of foraging time and giving away food, and the pups appear to learn a critical behavior faster than they would without the interaction. Still, many have argued that a functional definition of teaching, such as this, does not capture many key components of human teaching. Gergely-Cispra, for example, suggests that while the meerkat behavior is a good example of scaffolding, modifying the environment in such a way as to facilitate individual learning, human teaching is much more than this. Human teaching often entails demonstrating information about the hidden properties of objects, e.g. their labels, their functions, their palatability, and this information is generalizable to different contexts. While one can say that the meerkats have learned the generalizable skill of how to kill, they likely learned this individually after being presented with prey. Human teaching, however, often includes description of how to engage in certain behaviors so that this is learned socially, not individually. Thus, although some examples of animal teaching may fit the current operational definition of teaching, this definition may need to be modified to more accurately define what we know about human teaching. Chimpanzee tool use cultures. Chimpanzees exist in Africa in geographically separated populations, and each has been the subject of long-term observation. In 1999, Whiten and 8 field researchers collaborated to examine whether certain behaviors might be best described as cultural variants that differed across the populations. For each population, the frequency of occurrence of 65 behaviors was estimated on a continuum from customary to absent. Among these behaviors were tool use behaviors described in Chapter 8, including ant fishing, nut cracking, and water sponging, as well as grooming postures that included holding hands. If a behavior was not observed in a population, researchers considered whether an ecological reason could be given for its absence, e.g., were there nuts available to crack? Of the 65 behaviors considered, 39 were common in some populations, but absent in others, even when the required ecological conditions were present. These behaviors are thus candidates for cultural variance, yet 2 other criteria were considered essential. First, there should be no reason to think that genetic differences could account for the group differences. Indeed, some behaviors like ant fishing occurred in different manners, e.g. swiping the ants off a stick with the hand versus putting the stick directly into the mouth in nearby communities with no known genetic differences. As a second criteria, the behavior should be considered to be the outcome of social learning, where information is transmitted across generations. Inconsistent with this, these behaviors are considered to be learned by juveniles from observing adults. Given these criteria for culture, some behavioral variations in wild chimpanzee populations have been described as being cultural. This characterization, however, is debated. One hesitancy was alluded to above. The term culture has a nuanced meaning in the fields of anthropology, archaeology, and psychology, and a short list of criteria fails to capture the full meaning. A second cause for concern is whether the observation of behavioral differences in the wild really can exclude ecological causes or be truly said to result from social learning. Evidence for traditions. Given the difficulties inherent in studying social transmission in wild populations, the study of culture in animals has started to take a new tack. Researchers are able to examine the transmission of tool-using behavior within captive populations, where the precise spread of a behavior can be tracked and the ecological variance can be minimized. Additionally, some researchers have opted to use the word tradition to characterize a population-wide variation in behavior. These studies have often used boxes such as the artificial fruit apparatus used by Whiten et al. 1996, effectively creating a two-action test. A chimpanzee demonstrator in one group is trained to open the box using one of two actions, while a second demonstrator in another group uses the other action. When a demonstrator is introduced to a group, the group tends to learn the action demonstrated. In one study using this methodology, a transmission chain was documented such that an observer learned the box opening from the trained chimpanzee, and then another observer learned from the first observer, and so on. Though these data support the claim that a novel behavior can be spread through a group of chimpanzees via social learning, and that other groups may develop other novel behaviors in the same manner, the question remains as to whether chimpanzees can be said to have culture in any meaningful way. The traditions that are seen with chimpanzees may be best understood as the building blocks of the cumulative culture of human populations. Human culture is considered unique because traditions learned by imitation are modified and improved by individual learning and teaching, effectively ratcheting up over generations. Species that are limited to learning from others primarily through emulation or other forms of social learning must spend time relearning much of what others have already learned. Thus, consideration of the evolution of culture points to some possible outcomes of species differences in social learning processes. As was seen in this chapter, however, there is still much to learn about these differences. Chapter summary. Learning can occur through an individual's own asocial experiences with the world or through observation of others' actions. Individual learning is not passed on from generation to generation. The learning mechanisms may be inherited genetically, but the learning occurs through an individual's own interaction with the environment. In contrast, behaviors learned through social learning can be spread from one generation to another. By some accounts, natural selection in animals capable of social learning should favor strategies that allow for discriminate learning. Two proposed strategies entail being discriminative about when to learn from others and being discriminative about whom to learn from. Research that has focused on the cognitive mechanisms underlying social learning has characterized at least 5 types of learning, some of which contain various subtypes: enhancement, observational conditioning, emulation, mimicry, and imitation. Many species appear to learn food preferences, mate preferences, and aspects of communicative behaviors from others. In much of this work, the focus has been to examine whether and under what circumstances social learning has occurred. At the end of the 1900s and to the present, the study of social learning has continued to focus on the question of whether true imitation is evident in animals and human children. From this research, new insight has been gained into the conditions under which imitation appears to occur, as well as the potential abilities that are unique to humans. Consideration of the evolution of culture points to some possible outcomes of species differences in social learning processes. Without imitation or teaching, it is possible that a species cannot have a human-like cumulative culture.